Well, thank everybody for joining this call. Again, we're doing kind of briefings each week, and this week we have a very, very special treat. Rich Goldberg. I don't know if all of you have been following him these last weeks, but I have been, and our team has been, because he is certainly the expert on Iran, who is really at the head of this this whole situation in the Middle East, as we're understanding more and more, learning more and more about that. I just want to introduce Rich. Rich, thank you for being with us on this Hanukkah 5th day. I can't remember how many weeks into the war. I think 10 or 12 weeks into the war. And we have an incredible group of people that are in this call, and people are going to be joining over the next 5 minutes. But I want to just introduce you and thank you for the incredible work that you're doing. Rich is senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies think tank. Glad that's not my thing. I'm the senior advisor for, because I might not be able to say it. But from 2019 to 2020, Rich served as the director for countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction for the White House National Security Council, which is just a major feat, Rich. It's really extraordinary. And he's been able to sort of expand his efforts into the U.S. missile defense cooperation with Israel, as USIEA has been very much a part of that. And he was able to get some of the advanced missile defense radar into the Negev, which is just critical. Can you imagine a war right now in Israel, really where the Negev is a central piece to what's going on, and not having had missile defense radar? It's just critical. So, Rich, thank you for your historical role that you're playing. Rich has emerged as the leading architect of the toughest sanctions that have ever been imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he is the lead Republican negotiator for 3 rounds of the sanctions targeting the central bank of Iran. And on it goes. We want to thank you for the role that you're playing, the leadership role, Rich. And just to begin, I want to ask that you would give us a general overview of how we kind of got to where we are. Since the Trump administration, where the strongest sanctions that ever occurred really on Iran took place, and then how did we get to where we are now? Just give us an overview.
Yeah, I think the quick and dirty of it all is during the Obama administration, when we were in the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA as we call it, we were in a very flawed strategic paradigm where we were essentially opening up the spigots for Iran to get more money that could be poured into its terror proxies, like Hezbollah that we see right now firing missiles down at Israel from southern Lebanon, like Hamas that we see carry out October 7th from Gaza, like terror cells that we see the IDF combating every day right now inside the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, like the Houthis in Yemen that you're seeing on a daily basis now, not just sending ballistic missiles or cruise missiles or drones, but attacking international maritime shipping in the Red Sea and threatening to do more. And of course, you see the nightly attacks on our bases in Iraq and Syria. Again, Iran's money provided to their own militias, terrorist groups that they have built and funded in both of those countries to attack the United States and try to drive our influence out of the region. All of that during the time period we were in the JCPOA was expanding. Their terror infrastructure was growing. Their budgets for the Revolutionary Guard Corps and for their terror proxies was going up. Their budget for their missile program to develop the kind of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and missile carrying drones that we're seeing on display today, those budgets were going up. The testing cycles for all of those platforms were at historic highs. And in fact, the only thing we were getting in that nuclear deal, while funding all of this terrorism and missile activity, raising the threat against the United States and our allies, was a temporary and very narrow set of concessions on their nuclear program, allowing them to continue in secret to continue research and development towards nuclear weapons, develop these advanced centrifuges we see on display today that allow them to spin uranium very, very fast to higher levels, so they're that much closer to a nuclear breakout scenario, while of course advancing their development of nuclear capable missiles to finally one day put a nuclear device onto a missile and deliver it to its target. So when President Trump said we're getting out of the nuclear deal, this was to say that, we can't be in this failed paradigm anymore. We can't be funding all of the threats against us and getting almost nothing in return for it, except a delayed, even larger threat on the nuclear program in addition. And so we went into this era of maximum pressure where we brought back all of our sanctions that the Congress had enacted prior to the JCPOA. We started layering on more and forcing them to a historic level, trying to drive Iran's oil revenue towards zero as much as we could. And in fact, what did we see by the end of 2020? Right before the change in administration, the IMF had told us that Iran's accessible foreign exchange reserve was down to $4 billion. This was a regime that was running out of money, and we saw it playing out in its terror proxies. News reports of Hezbollah literally passing the hat, trying to raise some money because Iran had pulled back its budget, Hamas's budget being cut, the Houthis under pressure with money problems, but also obviously our empowerment and enablement of the Saudis and Emiratis to go after their infrastructure. And we were actually starting to push back on Iran's presence in Iraq and in Syria, really trying to roll back that presence and give the Iraqi government an opportunity to stand on its own feet, free of influence from Tehran. That was the construct we were in, alongside a restored military deterrent, as we had seen President Trump take out Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of 2020. We saw the Israelis take out the godfather of Iran's nuclear weapons program, who was still heading the secret military organization that continues work on nuclear weapons, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And so this was a regime that was really in a different place when they were coming into 2021, and they didn't quite know what they were going to get. Now, President Biden had pledged to go back to that JCPOA. It was a campaign promise. And Iran had started escalating its nuclear program during the transition in January of 2021. And what happened was we spent the last 2.5 years chasing after the Iranians, trying to get them back into that flawed deal, trying to get back to that flawed construct. We already were starting to allow a lot of the oil sales to increase as part of the incentive, the carrot approach, to try to get the Iranians back in the deal. And then earlier this year, we being Washington, the United States, under this administration, entered into an unacknowledged nuclear agreement with Iran back in May. That was billions and billions of dollars, both money that had been frozen in accounts starting to be made available for Iran's budget support, and then a historic level high of allowing Iran's oil to flow without any sanctions enforcement to China. Again, billions of dollars that we saw the regime starting to enrich themselves with. Where did that money go? That money has gone into its terror infrastructure, as you would expect. It's gone back into their proliferation and missile R&D. It's gone into their support for Russia, for use against Ukraine. And so you see the capabilities now, the expanded budgets of this terror infrastructure on display. What we got for this deal was supposed to be Iran simply agreeing not to go to the 90% weapons grade uranium threshold. That's 90%. So they're staying right under that threshold still today, but expanding the nuclear threat right underneath that threshold. So actually we're facing a broader, deeper, greater threat in the long term again, while allowing all this money to flow, which is being used to fund things like October 7th and Hamas. So this is the dangerous situation we're in. We're seeing the proxies reactivated with budgets in Iraq and Syria. You're seeing what's happening from the Houthis in Yemen. You're seeing what's happening from Hamas. You're seeing Judea and Samaria terror cells. You're seeing Hezbollah. None of this is in a vacuum. None of these are independent actors. They all are taking coordination, direction, in addition to training, resources, equipping from Iran, from the IRGC. And unfortunately, we are still living sort of in an October 6th policy world, in a post-October 7th world, where all that sanctions relief from back in May continues to flow. We have not seen oil sanctions enforcement. We have not seen accounts locked down for the Iranians. So that is the conundrum we are in right now. And the one of the two failed strategic pillars that we're seeing played out. The other failed strategic pillar, of course, are the Qataris, a longtime sponsor and ally of Hamas itself, the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic extremism throughout the Middle East. Just a quick note on that. But I think it's important to understand the role that Qatar plays as well. This is a country we had gone to post 9/11. They had agreed to host a very important airbase, which had expanded into a combined air operations center where we have run 2 wars out of and really become a hub for central command air planning and air operations. But at the same time, we allowed the Qataris to move forward in a geopolitical situation where they were financing, sponsoring, hosting some of the worst actors of the Middle East. And the delusion that we sort of had it ourselves, this is a bipartisan delusion. It's also not just American, it's an Israeli delusion as well for many years, that somehow this Qatari influence on actors like Hamas or the Taliban or others would moderate them, would bring them into the fold, would legitimize them as governing actors. It was a failed recipe for the Taliban, which we saw play out in 2021. And October 7th, we saw that recipe blow up in our faces with the Hamas massacre as well. Again, living in October 6th at the moment, from a policy perspective, Hamas's leadership still alive and well in Qatar. Qataris still supporting Hamas, holding themselves out to be an important channel for hostage negotiations, for dialogue, for what comes next in the region. Again, just like we need to reset assumptions and get back to an actual quality strategy on the Iran front, we need to reset assumptions and change the strategic paradigm on Qatar as well.
That's so good. Rich, thank you for that. That is a brilliant overview and so completely accurate, just on where we are. It's just hard to believe. It really is that we could have had such a stranglehold on Iran, down to $4 billion that they had in their bank, where they were penniless, to be able to do much. They were strangled. What do you believe today? We're watching, we're really involved with Congress. So there's an act called the SHIP Act that seems very promising. It passed through the House with real strong bipartisan support, is sitting in the Senate now, has bipartisan support there as well. And it seems to treat what you're saying. It has the sanctions going to their petroleum industry, and it sanctions the nations that are trying to do business with Iran. So it has a very holistic approach. Is there anything that you see that this administration could do now against Iran that actually depends on congressional action? And are there sanctions that they can put into place, if Congress authorized it? Talk about that.
Glad you brought up the SHIP Act. I would say there's 3 important pieces of legislation that the House has passed that are sitting in the Senate. And if the Senate were to make moves and force votes on certainly 2 of them, I would say all 3 of them would be important. You will actually shut down the current policy on Iran very quickly and force us back to a posture of pressure, not appeasement. How do you do that? One, you mentioned the SHIP Act. That is a bill that tries to get at this non-enforcement of U.S. sanctions on Iran's oil exports. We've already made it the law, a mandatory law, not permissive, that unless the president issues a national security waiver, if the Treasury Department finds evidence of companies involved in moving oil from Iran, they have to get sanctioned. They have to get hit. They're not doing it. They're basically telling the Treasury Department, don't bring the list to us, because if we don't see the list, we don't have to act on the list. And we know that's happening. I know that's happening. What they do have, though, is a list of the ports in China where this oil is being received. That is an obvious intelligence community function to know where the ships have landed. You may not know exactly who's involved taking them off the ships, where the oil is going, what refineries are involved, et cetera. You may actually know that, but let's assume you don't. You absolutely know the ports involved. Well, this bill, the SHIP Act, basically says the president must impose sanctions on the ports, on the port authorities, all the entities involved in the ports. Well, that would cripple all those ports in China, subject anybody who uses those ports potentially, does business with those ports, to U.S. sanctions as well. That's a major threat against Chinese commerce the president doesn't want to have to use. So That's the dance going on the SHIP Act right now to try to force the administration to crack down on the
Yes.
oil sales, which they could do by threat of this bill. Two other important things that could happen. Number one, we
Mhm.
have the No Funds for Iran Act, which just passed in the last 2 weeks
Mm.
from the House of Representatives. This would force the administration to withdraw waivers and any general licenses from the Treasury Department that have allowed two big spigots of money to open up. The $6 billion that everybody knows about, that
Right.
was part of the hostage ransom payment that's sitting in
Mhm.
Qatar, and the $10 billion that most people don't know about that was opened even before that.
Mm.
A waiver, by the way, issued just in the last 3 weeks to continue allowing Iran access to that $10 billion after October 7th. That is money that has been sitting in escrow in Baghdad that we're now allowing to move through Europe, get exchanged for euros, and go into Oman, into Iranian accounts there. $16 billion total or more
Mm.
that is available now to support the regime's budget imports, basically. And so this bill, if passed into law, would shut down, freeze those accounts, not allow Iran any access to that money. That might be the biggest flashpoint, quite frankly, and something where
Yes.
you might see Senate Republicans
Mhm.
force a vote soon enough, which will really upend the nuclear agreement that the administration negotiated earlier in the
Mhm.
year. The last one I will mention is the Massa Act.
Okay.
This one has to do with human rights and holding Iran accountable for what it has done to its own people since the
Mm.
killing of Masa Amini and the uprising that we saw. Protests continue every single day in Iran. We just don't hear about it anymore, but it's happening dozens upon dozens. This would force the administration to impose sanctions on the supreme leader, on the
Right.
Ayatollah, on everybody around him for human rights purposes. Would still have the same implications as far as freezing assets, etc. Why is that important? Well, if you go back to last fall, when the administration was very close to a much bigger public nuclear deal with Iran that fell through last fall around Labor Day, the administration reportedly had offered to withdraw President Trump's executive order imposing sanctions on the Supreme Leader's office. That's something that the Iranians have asked for in negotiations. If you pass the Massa Act and put mandatory human rights sanctions on the Supreme Leader and his office because of what he's
Mm.
done to his own people, you
Mhm.
actually upend that potential carrot as well.
Do you see anything else? Do you see anything else, Rich, that they need to do? And why is the White House at this point not willing, or are they willing? Are they changing their mind? Because it seems like Congress is changing their mind. You've got a lot of bipartisan support behind these bills. So are we watching a shift, a change, a pivot in policy potentially?
I do not detect a change in policy whatsoever at this point. I see two different policies that don't actually work together. I have a Hamas policy that's sort of a Hamas policy, even though we haven't
Mhm.
changed our policy on any of Hamas's sponsors like the Qataris or the Iranians, but there's Washington support for Israel militarily in Gaza alone going after Hamas. It's an important thing, right?
Mm.
I'm very pleased to see the administration just this weekend bypassing any concerns,
Yes.
providing more shells, mortar shells to the IDF,
Mhm.
the continued assistance politically, the veto in the Security Council on Friday. These are important things. We should applaud these things, but they are completely disconnected from a larger strategy that enriches and legitimizes the sponsors of Hamas. That doesn't make sense to me.
Mhm.
So, what could we be doing more? We could be enforcing robust sanctions against any sponsors of Hamas. That
Mhm.
would put Qatar finally to the test of having to cut off their relationship. It would also, by the way, talk to the Turks and
Mhm.
other actors who provide material support to Hamas. I don't want to diminish the role Turkey has had in supporting Hamas over the years and the disinformation network that they run, in addition to Al Jazeera, to amplify their propaganda. So those kind of Hamas type sanctions would be important. Enforcement of our Hezbollah sanctions worldwide would be very important. How about redesignating the Houthis as a
Right.
foreign terrorist organization, the lowest hanging fruit, as the Houthis on Iran's orders firing Iranian missiles towards U.S. Navy destroyers in the Red Sea on a constant basis
It's
and
incredible.
attacking international shipping. We have not done that. We have not
Mhm.
done that yet. The administration took them off the FTO list, as it's called, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, in January 2021. One of its first foreign policy moves, by the way, and it's not gone back on. This is a political decision. You have a couple of meetings in the
Right.
White House, and it
Mhm.
so I just don't see the Iran policy
Evidence.
changing, unfortunately. I don't see any of these pieces really changing. It's a very micro targeted. We have a Gaza situation. Let's contain to a Gaza policy and keep everything else intact to try to avoid any escalations, as they call the watchword of the White House,
Mhm.
escalation. We saw that play out on the Russia front
Mhm.
for a long time. Now we're seeing it play out in the Middle East as well.
Mhm. It really, that was very helpful to understand that, because I think there can be that sense that, wow, maybe the White House or this administration is understanding this better, and it seems like they do not quite understand it, or that there's just some things that we're missing that they're doing behind the scenes to try to keep something going there with Iran. It's really frightening, and it's so dangerous and hard to believe. And I think finally Americans are understanding how dangerous this is, and this could be on our soil. All of this, we could really begin to see that uptick in if we don't, deal with Iran. So thank you for that information. Let me ask you this, Rich. The Pentagon said on December 5th that they're ready to help a maritime task force among the allied nations to protect merchant shipping in the Red Sea following the series of Houthi missile attacks. What would that look like?
So it would look a lot like what we have done in two other domains in the past. One that people may not remember as well, which was the anti-piracy mission, where we were seeing a major uptick a decade ago in Somali-based piracy. We formed an international task force, a combined task force, to patrol the waters off the Horn of Africa
Mhm.
and respond to distress calls when possible, provide escort, etc. This was really a defensive measure. It was, I don't want to call it a band-aid. It's an important measure to take, but it is not rooting out the cause of the problem. It's treating the symptoms. And of course, you need to treat the symptoms, but you also need to
Mhm.
go at the actual disease and pull it out by its roots, which was a separate set of special operations, which actually did happen alongside other issues in the Horn of Africa. The other place where we've seen this, at least from this administration, this is far more recent. This is pre-October 7th. You'll recall, it just feels like ancient history to everybody, but it was this summer. Iran was seizing tankers in the Gulf and had continued to
Yes.
attempt to harass and potentially seize other oil
Mhm.
tankers. And so the administration has actually already done this once. They surged a Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Gulf. They moved additional naval assets. They worked with the Brits to offer naval escort for oil shipping coming out of Saudi Arabia, UAE. And they actually did respond to a number of distress calls and fired back on the IRGC a couple times when they were trying to take vessels. It did put an end to what Iran was doing at that time. This may or may not work. I mean, I imagine it's going to be a very similar situation.
Mhm.
You're stressing your assets now, by the way, because the threat in the Gulf can reappear at any time. So
Right.
now you're also providing some sort of maritime security mission patrolling the Red Sea as well. We have a naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. By the way, there's this whole thing in China going on, and we just like aren't really talking about it at the moment.
Mhm.
So we are really stressing the U.S. Navy right now
Mhm.
because we're responding to symptoms instead of treating the disease. And
Mhm.
so it is important for international commerce to actually provide this opportunity, provide the maritime security. But in the end, what are we doing to actually root out the threat in Yemen, which will only continue to grow and make this a higher risk for years to come to all international shipping? Because,
Mhm.
by the way, we haven't even seen the full extent of their capabilities. They also have, we think, mining capabilities as well. If they were to mine the Red Sea in addition to firing missiles and drones at international shipping, this can't just be allowed to sit there and continue to metastasize. Something is going to need to be done there. There are
Mhm.
complications with the Saudis that have a deal with the Houthis right now that was brokered with the Iranians and the Chinese earlier in the year. that was a response to U.S. policy abandoning Saudi Arabia for 2 years. So this is like this horrible Gordian knot that the administration has created through bad policy for 2.5 years. And it's all coming home to roost right now, and they're trying to untie it. But rather than address the root sources of the knot, we're just now going to have to treat these symptoms. And I don't think that's sustainable.
Rich, why do you think that they are choosing to be I mean, they're not choosing to be negligent because nobody thinks that they're being negligent. I mean, nobody, if you're being negligent, you actually aren't trying to be negligent necessarily. What is their, why are they doing it this way? Why are they missing this? What is your observation? What do you understand as to why this administration, knowing that Iran is close to nuclear breakout and might have achieved it, I want to get to that question just on, is it too late for, us to deal with Iran on the nuclear front? But more importantly, why is this administration having a hard time seeing that this is the problem and they need to go directly toward that?
I think several reasons. Number one, having negotiated things in the past on Capitol Hill administration, owning a policy, inventing a policy. You can have such blinders on where you really have convinced yourself that this is the right thing. And you can just rationalize all the problems and flaws in a strategy away, where you just sort of ignore it and just continue to drive on and mitigate problems as you go, believing these are simply things that will come up, speed bumps on the road to the correct objective. The correct objective in their view is some sort of balance in the Middle East between powers that will allow for a sustainable, lack of conflict in the foreseeable future, which allows us to pivot away from the Middle East. That somehow, if you weaken the Saudis and the Emiratis, equalize them in power to the Iranians, they will have to coexist. They will sue for peace with each other, like you saw in January. And then, somehow that will just allow Iran to say, okay, we're not threatened anymore. We have just enough of what we want in the region. We're not going to go across the nuclear threshold. And somehow we can continue to buy or rent the time we have through various extortion rackets to keep the Iranians happy and not attack us, not build a nuclear weapon, et cetera. I mean, this entire concept is being shredded every day. It is hard to understand how you can look at the chessboard at the moment and not say this is a completely outrageous set of assumptions that have been disproven at this point. And yet, whether it's because of the potential for crisis in a re-election, a desire to just focus on Russia and try to contain everything else in the world, you can think of good reasons, you can think of bad reasons for this, but there's certainly just blinders on of contain, no confrontation, pay whatever racket's necessary, try to get quiet everywhere we can, one front at a time, support Israel just in Gaza, and shut everything else down. By the way, it's only so long that's all going to work, because at some point the IDF is going to move from Gaza to Lebanon. Right. It's already being telegraphed in the last couple of days. And as much as the administration might be trying to pressure the Israelis not to go after Hezbollah, that's not going to be a political consideration inside Israel after October 7th. There are towns on the northern border that have been evacuated with people who will never return so long as Hezbollah is on the other side of that border.
And you know what, Rich, it seems that what we're understanding, and I think Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, was very, very clear that in order for those civilians to move back to, and there's 100,000, 150,000, we're not talking about a small number that are sitting in hotels in Tel Aviv. They've got to go back to their homes. They're going to have to create some sort of a buffer zone, which seems like it's going to be some boots on the ground. Maybe not. Maybe they'll come to an agreement that they would back all the way up. Hezbollah would back all the way up as they are supposed to be, through some treaty that was formed a while ago. I don't know exactly what it is, but comment on that. Don't you believe that there's going to have to be a buffer zone?
I worked on this for almost a decade on Capitol Hill, from 2006 until I left the Hill. And we still work on it to some extent today because of the failure. At the end of the Lebanon-Israel War in 2006, the UN Security Council passed a resolution 1701 that basically said that Hezbollah could not be armed, could not have a military position south of the Litani River, which is where its base of operations is in southern Lebanon. This is a large swath of land.
Right.
It is where the bulk of Hezbollah's 150,000 rockets and missiles are held. It is where they will plan various terror operations against Israel in the future. And this was supposed to be the buffer zone that
Like
was
20
imagined after that
kilometers? Is
war.
it 20? Is it 20
Yeah,
kilometers? Something like that?
it is a large distance to the Litani, relative terms, and so Hezbollah is not going to walk itself from Israel's border to north of the Litani River. It has not done so for 17 years of a Security Council resolution. Billions of dollars, I mean billions of dollars, that we have spent for a UN peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, whose mission was to enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and has never done so. Billions of dollars into the Lebanese armed forces to help that UN peacekeeping force enforce that resolution, which it has never done. And we're suddenly going to have some sort of political conversation between the Israelis and the Lebanese over border demarcations. And in exchange, Hezbollah is just going to say, like, yeah, we're good. We're going north of the Litani River now. It's not going to happen. And so this is going to require military action by the Israelis, using all the lessons learned from 2006, all the lessons they're learning right now in Gaza. Remember, Hamas's missile rocket force is 10 times larger than Hezbollah's, is 10 times larger than Hamas's. These are longer range systems than Hamas has, more destructive, with precision guided munitions for upwards of 10,000 or more of these munitions. And so this is a lot of firepower that could rain down on northern Israel, central Israel at any point. The Israeli people need to be ready for that as well. The IDF understands that. And so it's not just going to be about Iron Dome and David Sling trying to intercept things. It's going to be a massive, overwhelming force up front from the IAF, from the Israeli Air Force, trying to knock out that capability. And remember, we talk about all of the disinformation from Hamas in Gaza that we see right now on full display from the UN and others. Hamas using human shields, Hamas using its weapons, basing its rockets, basing everything in hospitals and schools. Where did they learn that from? Hezbollah. Hezbollah were the ones that basically invented this. And so understand that what you see in Gaza exists in southern Lebanon as well. Their missiles, their infrastructure are embedded in civilian population centers as well. There's another major consideration that the Israelis have to think through.
Yeah, really, it sounds like it. And no wonder they want to take military control over Gaza, as they should, for a period of time, because they may end up in a war with Hezbollah. And it's so critical that it's remarkable the time we're in. Rich, I know it's hard to believe, isn't it, that you're even having to breathe all these words. Let me ask you this. We've been leading Congress to Israel since 2011, senior leaders of Congress, and we actually go through the area of Judea and Samaria, the Jewish towns and cities there. And so we've been taking Congress, and one of the focal points, obviously, for Congress is the missile defense program. It's the number one thing they do is they vote on an aid bill to Israel involving missile defense, and it's a major part of the U.S.-Israel collaboration. Do you believe? I mean, Netanyahu, for 10 years, solid years, it has been his mantra more than anything else. He has said to every world leader, every ambassador that has come through for as long as I've known him, he has talked about the critical issue with the Iranian nuclear program. And so he has been the world leader trying to lead that foray, keep sanctions on, and it has been an uphill battle every step of the way. Do you think that it's too late for a strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities?
No, I don't think so. One facility in particular that merits a immediate strike, if none other, is a new underground facility that has been under construction for a couple of years now near its Natanz nuclear facility. This is, according to public reporting, supposed to be deeper, more hardened than the
Mm.
Fordo underground facility at Qom. This could be an undeclared nuclear facility. It is likely what it is. If this facility is completed before there's military action against it, that could be unfortunately very game changing for Iran's next moves on its nuclear program, if it is indeed as impenetrable to military strike as reports would suggest. And so I think that at some point we are going to see action against at least that facility. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I imagine that's in the planning stages, at least for the Israelis. For the rest of the program, they are on the 1 yard line. I think we need to acknowledge that. You're not putting the genie back in the bottle at this point. To the extent that you can reconstitute a maximum pressure campaign sanctions posture on this regime, that is a good thing to deny resources to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It is a good thing for Iran to have less money, period. It is not potentially a solution to its nuclear program at this point. And so I think we have to be very clear-eyed about the need for military action to take out the nuclear threat, because look at how deterred the United States is today by the potential for an Iranian nuclear threat. God forbid it was a nuclear threat.
I know it. It's unbelievable. It really is. It's hard to imagine that we're in the situation that we're in, and it seems that it may take another administration to be able to get this set up right, and yet it's a long way off to get to that point. And well, Rich, this has been brilliant, and we could go on and on with you. Thank you for your knowledge and understanding, applying yourself so diligently to the times that we're in. It seems that during Hanukkah, as we light our candles, that we are not unlike the days of the Maccabees, and understaffed, under military, lack of military to be able to overthrow such a prevailing foe. And yet somehow God intervened, and there's a dropping off point for man where God steps in and he does the miraculous. And we are in need of some miracles, as we can all see. So I always urge this group to stay as watchmen on the wall for Israel, for the United States. There's a sense of brokering between heaven and earth, and making our appeals to God Almighty for his intervention, that he will interdict uniquely in this situation, as he did in all of Israel's wars. We should be expecting it, not hoping and wishing for it. And that's what Hanukkah is about, that expectation, that resolve, and that sense of rededicating ourselves at this time. So, Rich, thank you for being with us. U.S. Israel Education Association, everybody, as you know, is on the Hill, right in the deep of it all, educating Congress on these issues. And we have got a strong foray of leaders on the Hill that understand what needs to take place. This should encourage all of you. I think the effort at this point is really the U.S. administration needing to make a pivot, needing to change the way that they're seeing this, and be able to direct the sanctions to change their policy. And we may or may not see it. You would think by now we would be seeing that, a change in policy. And yet, as Rich said, we're not seeing that yet. So it's going to take Congress, and I think, Rich, you would agree with me, some sort of mass pressure from Congress to really drive home something with this administration, the White House, on enforcing sanctions and creating a context for the demise of Iran. And then again, as you said, just probably a military strategy on dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat, which, as you said, we're at the 1 yard line, so we might need to hurry. Anyway, Rich, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it, and your dedication is extraordinary. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Happy Hanukkah. Great. Thank you.